Hello everyone, my name is Marcel de Jong and welcome to today's webinar that will cover some of the new features that we've introduced in 2013, Maya 2013, Mudbox and MotionBuilder 2013, as well as the Subscription Advantage Pack, which was released right around a month ago or so. And then what I'm hoping to do is also illustrate a virtual production workflow using some of those new tools. So let's go ahead and jump into part of the presentation that will take us through some of the new features. So looking at this list here real quick, the focus for us has been on being able to bring in much larger data sets into Maya. And one thing that comes to mind here specifically is GPU caching. We've been able to open up several hundreds of millions of polygons and still be able to move around between 5 and 15 frames per second, which is pretty significant considering that the amount of data that we're dealing with. Now, in order to be able to open up much larger data sets, we also need editors that are a little smarter in terms of being able to display stuff that's associated with the stuff that we're bringing in. So we've done work on the file referencing side. For example, file referencing tools are currently available from within the outliner. We also did work on the node editor. We have a new node editor, which is kind of a hybrid between the hypershade, the hypergraph, and the connection editor. It does all those three things. You can graph nodes in there, and you can make or break connections. You can open up nodes, expand nodes to show and reflect the entire list of attributes that you can connect to. We also introduced support for alembic point caching, which is the format of choice for GPU caching. We introduced a number of Viewport 2.0 enhancements. Some of the screenshots of the cars, the Porsches in there, are directly of the viewport. We also have better support for fluids display. We introduced heat mapping, which is something that we'll cover in the demo. Atom, the animation transfer object model transfer format, it's a method to transport animation from one file to another version of that same file, of that same character, for example, or maybe a different character altogether. Human IK enhancements, quite a bit of improvements on the human IK side. In 2013, we introduced the ability to be able to continue to maintain custom controllers on rigs. And so that's a very useful thing if you have a legacy rig, for example, or maybe you just like working a certain way, to transport the animation onto that set of controllers rather than going down to the rig. MotionBuilder Live connection, that's something that we'll cover in the demo. I'll show you how to connect live to MotionBuilder, and that allows you to start working with one of the tools that we're using to build virtual production setups. Maya and Hair, all of the hair tools that I'm sure a lot of you have been familiar with for quite some time, are now brought under the Nucleus umbrella. So Nucleus actually is the solver for hair, which allows you to have hair interact with any kind of Nucleus object. The file path editor, the scene assembly toolset, and DX11, the last three there, were introduced in the Subscription Advantage Pack. The file path editor is just a quick way, and you can see a screenshot of it that's kind of inset here just below the Porsches, where you can see broken links or things that are missing in the scene that originally were part of the scene, and then fix those connections through kind of a smart mechanism as part of that file path editor. Scene Assembly Toolset allows you to quickly build multiple representations in your scene of objects. So you may not want to load all your geometry at its final resolution with all of its textures all the time. DX11 is now supported in Maya, so there's a switch, a rendering switch inside of Maya that allows you to switch from OpenGL to DX11, and I'll show that in the demonstration as well. So let's move on. Speaking of DX11, and this is a screenshot of Maya of a character that was built in Mudbox with Vector Displacement Maps. In this case, you're seeing Vector Displacement Maps at work. The model itself is relatively low in resolution, but the Vector Displacement Maps really make this shine. So this is all loaded through a DX11 shader. Now what that means is that this model can still be spun around and worked with in relatively high speeds, relatively close to real time. And what that means, of course, is that we can have very complex characters and still get feedback on animation performance. And that's kind of where this is all going. Again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that when we get to that. Speaking of Mudbox, These are the new things that were introduced in 2013, of which the biggest things are listed here. The key features are listed here: customizable UI with presets, and I'll highlight some of them. A better fall-off editor, some UI improvements when it comes to renaming nodes and reflecting the names of nodes that you're working on in the layer editor, for example. A reset switch for brushes, which is very useful when it comes to being able to go back to kind of a point of departure, kind of a place where you build your brushes from. It's very easy to get confused or to leave settings where they are, and they can really interfere with what your brush is doing and how it's behaving. We added a curve tool set that allows you to draw curves in screen space or directly onto the geometry. And that does translate to Maya or back, so you can generate these curves in Maya as well and bring them into Mudbox. We could do a flip from the camera position, which can be useful for certain operations, and we are now supporting 3D connection devices. Now, between the previous slide and this slide, you can see that we have an SR71 in here that has a lot of very hard-edged geometry. The SR71 I built to kind of illustrate that you can transport creased information and hard edges directly from Maya into Mudbox, and at higher resolutions as you're subdividing, still maintain geometry that respects those edges. And on the bottom right, you can see a custom UI in Mudbox. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one, which is MotionBuilder. And in MotionBuilder, the three features that I'll highlight in the demo are live data recording to disk, a feature called story clip grouping, and HeadsUp Displays. Live data recording to disk allows you to turn on a switch that instead of recording to RAM, records directly to disk, which allows for much longer sessions without interruption that you can then later on go ahead and edit. And what that does, it builds a temporary buffer file essentially on a location that you decide on. You can point to anywhere on disk, and depending on how much disk space you have, you can of course increase your, the more you have, the longer your sessions can be. Story clip grouping, there's an inset here on the bottom right that shows you what that looks like. You can create what's called a summary clip, which is essentially a folder inside of which these clips reside. So each of these clips could be a character in your scene, and you could simultaneously add multiple characters at the same time. You can still cut clips, move clips, stretch clips, etc., and also apply edits to the master controller or the summary clip that contains all of those individual characters. HeadsUp displays, I'll show you an example of that in the demo as well. You can actually have very sophisticated HeadsUp displays sitting on top of your cameras, providing you with all of the information that you need. Some of the other features here, Z-depth selection, which is very useful when it comes to selecting things when you can't move the camera. A temporary pivot, a similar type of tool where you can go in and quickly see a pivot and rotate or scale around it if you don't have the ability to be able to move the camera, which a lot of times you don't. A video display panel for, let's say, directorial control if you wanted that. Retiming tools, which are tools added in the F-curve editor that are the same as the retiming tools that we now have in Max and Maya as well. So it's kind of standardizing some of the tool sets that allow you to edit animation. And the last one there, which is kind of a big one, is 64-bit QuickTime, which concludes the list of key features for all products and gets us to the demonstration. So for the first part of this presentation, we'll start in Maya, and I'm going to talk a little bit about suites in general. Under the plugin manager, you'll find plugins for FBX-Maya.mll and OneClick.mll down in here. And when you make sure that those are turned on, you're running software of the same version, you'll be able to go into the file menu and see send functions to 3ds Max, Softimage, MotionBuilder, and Mudbox. Now you can send a scene or part of a scene to one of these packages to do something dedicated to that package, to do something that's better done elsewhere. So in the case of virtual production, for example, that would be MotionBuilder. In the case of modeling, that would be Mudbox, and those are the two things that we're going to be focusing on. So you could see these menus in here, and there's a send as new scene. There's an update current scene if you have an update to send across. And there will also be an update on the bottom right portion of the software in the case of Maya. In the case of Softimage, MotionBuilder, Mudbox, you can see that we have similar menus here. They slightly vary. For example, one of the things that I can do with MotionBuilder is build a live connection. And so what we're doing in that case is actually run the MotionBuilder kernel inside of Maya. And whatever it is that you do in MotionBuilder, whether it's retargeting or moving a character or setting keys, you can see update live inside of Maya. Okay, so once we have our character, this is the character we're going to be working with. And in this case, you can see there's not much in terms of definition on the surface. And that is exactly the kind of thing that I want to be able to do in Mudbox. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send this character over to Mudbox by sending it as a new scene. And then when it comes up in Mudbox, I can start to work with this in terms of sculpted detail on the surface as well as paint. So here's our character. And I already have this open in Mudbox, so for demo purposes, I can avoid the load times. So I just brought it up, and I also already subdivided it. So if we look at the resolution, you can see that this is quite dense. And we added 4 levels of subdivisions. So if I get a little closer and turn on the wire, you can see that we get quite a nice and fine resolution. So let's go ahead and move out a little bit. On the bottom right, you can see that we're at the active level of 4, where we have a highest level of 4, and you can see a frame per second refresh rate, as well as the amount of GPU that this scene takes up. Okay, so let's start with the UI. We now have customizable UI, so you can go to Windows and unlock the UI by hitting the lock switch. And what that does, it adds the double dotted outline for each UI element. So if I wanted to go ahead and customize this, I can very easily do that by saying, okay, let's say I wanted to build a painter's UI or a paint-based UI. I'm going to drag my paint tools off and maybe just kind of add those to the left here. As I open them up, you can see that the icons will kind of accommodate the space that's allowed for them. I might want to go in here and use my stamps. I'm going to go ahead and add those to the bottom. We can drag this up a bit so we automatically get these scroll bars. Maybe I want to use do the same kind of thing for stencils and fall offs. So I have these layouts kind of, let's go ahead and tear off fall offs and add it to the bottom. And I kind of redivide this and kind of distribute the space that we have on screen. All right, so we don't need our sculpt tools, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of those. Here are our curve tools that we can start to use to plot curves in screen space or on the surface. Let's go ahead and get rid of those. And then we also don't need our presets. And then our camera bookmarks, we don't need those. And so now what I have is a lot more vertical real estate through the center of the UI. So for standing characters that have kind of a vertical dimension, that works a little better, and it allows me to get a little closer to the model this way. So if I go in here and tear off the color editor, for example, I can add that as well. It allows you to add it to the top, the bottom, the left, the right, pretty much any way you want. I'm going to go in here and just kind of add that to the bottom over here. So we have a properties window up here, as well as a color editor and a layer editor, all integrated in the same UI. The other thing that you can do is go in and say, okay, maybe I don't want these stacked on top of each other. Maybe I prefer like a tabbed based layout, so it takes up less space. And I can also display more within a single tab. Of course, you would have to switch tabs if you wanted to access something else. For example, if I grab my fall offs, for example, I can go in here and drag them on top of my brushes, and now I get 2 tabs. I can go ahead and do the same over here and add my stamps as well as my stencils all to that same list of tabs. Of course, you can have a combined kind of layout as well. So part of it could be tabs, part of it could be stacked. So once this is all set up, you can now export your layout, and we can go ahead and save this off as something like a test.mudui, which is a basic text file that you can save off or import. I'm going to import a layout, and I'll use, in this case, I'll use the first one over here that says paint sculpt.mudui. And in this case, it also brought up a few windows, this curve window as well as my properties window, as floating windows. So floating windows are saved as part of that as well. This is all new in 2013. If I go ahead and hit the reset switch, you can see it takes me back to a default layout, and in this case, it's kind of a nice way to be able to always go back to that base, that factory default layout. But one thing you definitely do want to do, whether you're working in a custom or a default layout, is lock it. So you can still see that we have this double dotted outline everywhere. So as I'm painting across a surface or maybe sculpting something through a stencil or whatnot, it's easy to sometimes end up outside of the viewport and accidentally grab something like this and then have it end up somewhere on screen where you don't want it. So once you reset this, or when you load a custom UI, you want to make sure that you're locking it so that all those double dotted outlines, the little tear-offs, disappear from view. Okay, so the next thing is, if I go to my object list, you can see that we have something called a Lambert 4, and that particular shader now has a representation of its name in the properties window. So if I were to go in here and say, let's go ahead and rename this, it allows you to quickly edit the names of all your nodes in here, and that helps kind of keeping track or organizing your Mudbox scenes. Something else that's nice about this is that if I, for example, am painting on this character and I jump into either paint layers or sculpt layers, you can see that it gives you a sense of what it is that you're working on. So in this case, I am actually working on the monster body quad, which is down in here, this particular node over here. And so we always get a sense of what it is that we're working on. It used to not do that before. For paint, the same thing. Monster body quad, that's the geometry that we're actually generating textures for. So all the current layers listed belong to the geometry called monster body quad. So one of the other things that we did in here is add this reset button. And so as soon as you reset it, you get a default brush with default settings. So it's a really quick way, and this goes for all brushes, it's a really quick way to go back again to something like a factory default. So we have a basic brush over here. I can use a hotkey to quickly turn on mirroring so we get the same thing on the other side. You can see it's happening on the other side as well. I can attach a quick stamp to this. You can see that too is working on the other side. One other thing that's really nice about this is that if I brush this, for example, across the back, and we'll do this a little bit larger. Oh, by the way, brushes in Mudbox are GPU accelerated, so even very large brushes are still able to move across your surface very quickly. And in this case, as I brush, you could see that we get something of a pattern on that, but that pattern is very repetitive, and sometimes that's something you might want, but then sometimes you might not want that. So if we go up here, we can turn on randomization controls. If I do that, you can see that it starts to heavily randomize how the stamps are placed on the surface. So if I go in here and turn that on, we get control over randomization for rotation, for U offset, for V offset along the stroke, for scaling and intensity. And so by maybe taking out this and cranking up a rotation randomization, we're kind of able to create a general stroke that is very random but kind of follows exactly what it is that I'm painting. So that could be very useful. Or maybe if I wanted to add a pattern like based on a curve, I can use a curve and paint across the surface with this. And as I'm painting, you can see that curves are mirrored the exact same way. So let's go ahead and undo that. I'm going to turn off the mirroring hotkey. And I can paint a curve across the body or across screen space depending on where it is that I'm starting. So if I do something like this, for example, and I move the model, you can see this curve has no association with the model. It sits in screen space. Or if I go ahead and start somewhere in the geometry, we can go ahead and maybe add something over here and then have it follow the back and then maybe up the back again, something like that. And if you wanted to, you can go ahead and close this as well. As soon as you get close to the beginning point, it'll actually show you in kind of an iconic format how this gets added. This little orange circle that shows up that allows you to close that curve. If I go in here and grab a paintbrush, we can go ahead and select a paintbrush or a sculpt brush. Works for all brushes. We were working with sculpting, so let's go ahead and do this with a sculpt brush. We can now say stroke on curve, and it'll stroke that along the length of that curve. We can also go ahead and modify the intensity to make this a little more subtle, and maybe turn mirroring back on to also have the effect show up on the other side. And so it's a very quick way to control exactly where it is that my strokes show up and how they show up. I can also invert things like painting on a surface. So in this case, we have a brush with a basic pattern, and if I make this a little more intense, it's a little smaller, a little more intense, using the B and M hotkeys. Let's say we'll do a little bit of randomization here as well, so I'll turn that on. We can now go ahead and kind of paint this on the surface, and if I hold down Control, it actually inverts that. Right? Now the same thing goes for all the other brushes. So if I do this for paint, for example, I can go in here and paint with, on a diffuse layer, for example, we'll paint an orange color. If I hold down Control, it actually goes to blue. So it reaches across the color wheel to the other side and do that. Of course, if you have a pattern associated with that, it's no different, right? If I go in here and grab a pattern that I'm painting with, and if I increase the stamp spacing real quick, there it goes. You can see that the pattern starts to show up. If I increase the intensity a bit more, something like that, you can see that pattern show up. If I hold down Control, it doesn't invert the pattern, but it does invert the color, right? So it still respects the pattern that you're using, which is kind of nice. All right, so let's clean this up a little bit. I'm going to go in and actually delete that curve. That curve shows up in the outliner portion of Mudbox. We can go ahead and delete it while we keep the detail, of course. If I go back to Layers under Sculpt, I'm going to go ahead and turn off this detail. I'm going to create a new layer here, and I also want that layer associated with level 4. So if you look up here, you can see it says nothing right now as soon as I touch the model, and with a sculpt brush, of course, you can see that it now becomes associated with a level 4 as well. So some of the other interesting brushes that we can start to use for sculpting, for example, let's go ahead and reset this here real quick. And there it is, default brush. Our vector displacement brushes. These can be created custom and from scratch, depending on what it is that you need. You can turn this into anything. And the technique that you would use is a vector displacement extraction technique. So in other words, instead of just generating vector displacement maps that create all the displaced details, and including undercuts for characters, you could create just a basic flat plane, and then a second basic flat plane at a much higher resolution where you sculpt the detail of what you want to turn into a vector displacement brush. And then under Maps, Extract, you can go to New Operation, turn on vector displacement, make this a little smaller, and then set your target model, which would be the flat plane, and your source model, which would be the sculpted plane, and then extract. And so in this case, you can see that we actually added a few presets here for 2013 as well. We can now go all the way up to 16K or 32K maps. For a vector displacement map that you paint with, you typically don't need something this large. In fact, you're going to need something much smaller. But if you have an entire character that's the vector displacement mapped, then you might need something that big. Of course, down in here you would have to specify a name, and we can go in here and make sure that this TIFF 32-bit float RGBA is selected. Okay, so once that's done, you can bring the image that you've generated back onto a shelf by saying Add Stamp and browse for the images, and here they're loaded. So the first one over here I'm going to load and do something to the back of my character with. So if I go up in here and paint with this a little bit, you can see that it's doing something, but I'm not quite sure what. Now you can increase the strength, but you can also increase the buildup of this brush. And if I crank that up to, let's say, 100, I'm starting to get much more of a defined kind of shape. Now if I paint from top to bottom, you can see that the raised area shows up on the right side of this stroke. If I paint from bottom to top, it does the exact opposite. And that's because the image that's attached to this brush has an orientation. So if I paint with this counterclockwise, it raises up a scale like this, and I have mirroring turned on, so it does it to the other side. Or if I do it in the opposite direction, you can see that you create a recessed surface. So let's say I wanted to create scales that are kind of interlocking. I can go in here very quickly, just kind of close these and maybe make them quasi interlock and go around and create, a few of them. Something like that. You get the idea. And at some point you can also kind of interlock them across your mirror axis. And if I turn this off, it goes away. If I turn this back on, or we can dial these down in terms of a percentage. We can also set this to a negative value. So if I wanted to go in here and recess these, or recess these even more, you can. Or maybe I want to go ahead and overclock them at 200%, so we get a much more dramatic effect. You can see that works too. Okay, so the next brush here was extracted from a geometric detail that looked kind of like a tube. And so if I paint this with a very small brush, maybe a little larger, I can maybe add details to this gorilla that looked like kind of like a vascular pattern. Something like this, maybe across the arm, some details. I'm going to apply some pressure here or there. I might need a little bit more of a brush here or a slightly higher resolution surface, but you get the idea, something like that. We can also go in and say, in this case, maybe I want to add some cuts, and let's use a larger brush, and it's going to do again the same thing on the other side. I'm going to increase this, maybe add a crease over there, add a crease over here. You can see this is much more difficult to control in terms of geometric stability. So I'm going to go in here and turn on steady stroke. Steady stroke, we've recalibrated this so that we can have much longer steady strokes, and so in this case I'm going to kind of run this along the bottom right there and then maybe soften that up a bit. I might need a longer lead on this. You can see that that lead now can get very, very long before you're actually starting to use it. That's another way to add much more detail to your surface, vector displacement brushes. Now in the end, of course, when you add all this detail and you end up with a finished character, you might want to turn everything into a vector displacement map. So in this case, what I did is I turned on a layer with lots of detail for the entire surface. On the front, the back, and you can see everywhere we have some basic skin detail with some raised areas for these darker spots on his back. Next thing I'd like to do is kind of take you through some of the new paint stuff. We've added a few things for painting as well, but also incorporate some basic things in paint that new users might be interested in. I'm going to start creating a little bit, lay down a little bit of color using a stencil. So let's go ahead and turn off stamps. So we have our stencils. Let's turn off stamps. We have our stencils over here. Everything is turned off. I can go to something like a pattern like this, or maybe something like this. If I use a projection brush, you can see it starts to pick up the color. If I use the S hotkey, I can move, rotate, and position my logo or my pattern or my texture in between the camera and my model. I might want to add something like this, or if I'm doing something like a rust pattern, I can do that. Maybe I'm creating some orcs and I need some hand slaps with paint. I can do that. In this case, what I'd like to do is maybe add a skin texture of some sort. I can go to my paintbrush and set that to a specific color. Paint this through my stencil onto my character. And if I wanted to, I can of course go in and select my stencil and say I want to tile this, use tiles, flip horizontal, or maybe pick something that's easier to tile. Let's say we'll pick something like this, slightly larger and heavier texture. And let's get a little closer so we get a little bit of a sense of a texture on that surface. And then if I wanted to, I can go ahead and it's doing the other side as well. So once that's done, we can go ahead and jump in here and say let's maybe select a dissolve or a darken or maybe a multiply. Once this is selected, you could just use the up and down arrow keys to step through all the blend modes, trying to find one that works best. So maybe like a soft light or an overlay would work best. And so you could very quickly jump into, you can see the texture very clearly here. Jump into a blend mode that works. Now what's nice about this too is that all this is maintained if you were to take either this layer or this entire channel into Photoshop. So you can go ahead and take the entire channel into Photoshop by saying export channel to PSD. It takes all the layers out of the diffuse channel and organize them in a way exactly the way they are in Mudbox. And then you can make edits on the Photoshop side. So let's say this is exactly what you want. We can now go ahead and kind of zoom out and maybe get into the diffuse channel, right click, we can do a duplicate selected, and then move that over into the specular channel. So if I turn on the specular channel here, it's essentially a direct duplicate of my diffuse channel. And so in this case we get a specularity with a color temperature. And if I wanted to see this, I can just go into solo as diffuse, which will show me my specular channel as a color channel. So here it is. You can see what this spec channel looks like. If I then wanted to go in here and maybe desaturate that a bit so we get more of a grayscale for specularity, we can do that simply going to adjust color. One of the other things that I did is I color coded the curve. The curve is actually a little harder to see. By default it's gray. Now it's red, so it's very obvious. And I can go in here and just kind of move this over and kind of increase the lightness towards the top of that spectrum, maybe have more darkness, higher contrast essentially. Or we can use a preset to do that, or maybe just shift the U if that's what we wanted to do. We could do this and then maybe desaturate this a bit, maybe introduce more light, more white or more black, or we could use a preset. If I were to go in here and say let's use more contrast, something like that. Or maybe hit reset, go back to where we started from. We can also convert this to just a plain black and white channel. This is exactly what I want to do for specularity in this case for the purpose of this demo. I'm going to say OK, and we have our black and white specularity. Now the next thing I might want to do is turn my diffuse channel back on, and when that comes back on you can see that we get a nice black and white specular. This black and white channel you can now optimize as well. If we go to preferences under render, there's an optimize monochrome paint layers that I have turned on, which actually allows you to have monochrome paint layers, black and white grayscale layers, use up less memory. So this too, once this is set up, I can go ahead and duplicate that and bring that into a bump map. So if I turn on the bump map, you can see that we have a grayscale bump map that builds that relief on the surface. Now that's really not what I want to use. I want to go ahead and actually use normal maps for this. But we do have to start off with a grayscale map, a classic kind of bump map situation. If I were to right click over that, new in 2013 as well, is this normal map from bump. And if I go ahead and say OK, it's going to take a second to build the actual normal map channel. And then once the channel is built, it puts the map inside of it. And you can see there it is. So I'm going to turn off bump. I'm going to dial down the normal map to, let's say, about 30-some%. Something like this is fine. And if I get a little closer between the spec map and the normal map, we get quite a bit more detail and quite a bit nicer surface. This needs to be output to Maya, so we can send paint layers which will generate a shader with a layer texture network, or we can flatten the paint layers which will essentially compound all those layers into a single layer that then gets attached to a shader in Maya that we can use as reference. The extracted maps we have to apply separate because they're extracted from the geometry and they're saved elsewhere. They're not part of that paint layer structure. Alright, so once this is set, we can go ahead and say let's take this back to Maya by saying File, Send to Maya, Update Current Scene, or send it as a new scene depending on what it is that I'm sending across, and we can continue on from there. So once we're back in Maya, we can start to work with the DX11 shader that we currently have on the surface. And first thing I want to show you here is that DX11 shaders truly are completely integrated into the software. So if I, for example, go into a shaded mode, you'll see that some of the other shaders in the scene that are Fongs are going to gray, but so does the DX11 shader. If I, for example, were to go to a lit mode and maybe grab a light in the background, for example, and then under lighting use selected light only, you'll see that as soon as I start moving this around, it'll respond the same way to light as all the other shaders do. And so DX11 is completely integrated into Maya. To get this to work, it's fairly straightforward. Really all we have to do is switch rendering engines. I'm going to go back to a full lit mode here. So under Preferences, there we go. Under Preferences, let's go ahead and move this in, and then under Display, you can switch the rendering engine from OpenGL to DirectX 11. You have to save and restart, and the next time you run Maya, you'll be in DX11 mode. Under the Hypershade window, we now get DirectX 11 shaders that you can start to create for your geometry the same way you create shaders for anything else. So if we look at a DirectX 11 shader, this is the one that I just created, you can see that it automatically loads a file called MayaUberShader.fxo. That's a shader file that gets loaded into the shader. It's a hardware shader, so it takes advantage of the GPU. This particular shader file here is a compiled shader file, so it's particularly fast, but it's also including pretty much anything you want to be able to include on any kind of shading operation. Now, if you look at the Viewport 2.0, this is all running in Viewport 2.0. DirectX 11 is supported in Viewport 2.0. So let's select the DX11 shader that's assigned to this character and kind of look at all the individual controls that we get for this. The first thing I want to make sure of that we have turned on is this tessellation. So the tessellation that will take place will also happen on the GPU. And just make sure that it is turned on so that any shading operation down in here that takes advantage of the tessellation can actually be displayed. If we set this to a wireframe mode, you can see that the wire looks different than the wire that we actually use to model with. This is purely used for GPU acceleration purposes. This is the wire that is being cached onto the GPU and makes this shader so fast. We have a rim lighting control that we can turn on. If I turn that up, we can then go ahead and kind of control the intensity and the fall off and that sort of thing. So if we go ahead and drop this down, maybe drop the intensity, we just have a very ambient kind of effect that way. We could switch into linear space lighting as well if we wanted to do that. You can see it dramatically changes what the lighting looks like on the surface. We have an automatic connection that's being built between the lights and the scene. It does up to 3 lights right now. But we can also go in here and kind of force which light will be loaded into which section so that you get some additional controls. We have a diffuse section, of course. The diffuse map is currently visible. We can turn that on or off. You can see it's pointing to a map that was painted in Mudbox and then loaded into Maya. Over here we have an opacity control that we can start to work with. We can also mask this so we can have partial opacity in certain areas. The specular map, which is currently not turned on, if I turn that on, you can see how that works. And if I were to go in here and let's say we'll crank up the specular color and power, that's a way to distribute the specular. Or we can turn on this skin control. And as I crank up the specular color, you can see that that still works. I can then also go in here and kind of really make that specular diffuse. Or if I crank this all the way up, we can create very plastic looking surfaces. So let's say we'll have something fairly large but still fairly concentrated and intense like this. We can turn on the normal map in here as well. You can see how that comes in. That was generated in Mudbox from a bump channel, which was generated from a specular channel. We can, if we wanted to, introduce a reflection map as well. We can also go in and drop down in this section, turn on displacement. And by turning it on doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to see it. We have to actually increase the displacement height. So let's say I'll set this to a value of 10 or 12 or so. And you can see that between the normal map, if I go in here and turn that off real quick, and the displacement map, if I were to go in here and turn this off real quick, that they do very individual things. So if I were to go ahead and look at some of the bumps on his back, you can see that the displacement is already there for that, but the true definition is brought in as soon as we turn on the normal map. Down in the translucent section, you can turn on translucence. You can also turn on the thickness mask, which allows you to actually map the translucence. But before I do that, let's go ahead and kind of look up here at the light. You can see the light is penetrating obviously through a large portion of this model. This is the light that's causing that. You can go ahead and turn on that thickness mask and browse for an image. So let's go ahead and look at a directory where we store this stuff. And in this case, we're going to go ahead and drop down into the Mudbox folder. Under the belly files, we have a subsurface scatter.tiff, and this is a file that was simply painted as a diffuse layer. So you could just add extra diffuse layers for different types of channel operations. And let's go ahead and open that, load that. You can see that we're getting much more translucent bumps here, as well as very translucent ears and very translucent hands. So you can control exactly where that quasi subsurface kind of effect comes, where that's located on the surface. So we're back in Mudbox for a little bit, and I pulled up an image of a model that was built in Mudbox. This model was built by Jesse Sandifer, and we're just showing a little bit of the complexity that can be created in Mudbox that we can then bring in through Vector Displacement Maps into Maya. I actually have the model open here as well. So if we jump into a 3D view, you can see it's extremely dense. But let's get a little closer, and you're starting to see some geometry there as I get very close. So here too, you can see there's quite a bit of detail. There's quite a bit of definition on this character all around. So the total poly count on this is over 40 million polygons. Obviously, this is not something that I want to bring into Maya, and therefore what we need to do is extract all the maps in the form of vector displacement maps. Now the nice thing about these things is that we can map them onto a DX11 shader and actually see them in Viewport 2.0. Once that's done, we can actually go back to Maya, and I'm going to just show you what it looks in Maya. And once again, we're back in Maya. I already have the model open. You can see what it looks like. Let's go ahead and turn on the wireframe on shaded so we can get a sense of what the resolution is. It's relatively low in resolution. It's about 12,500 faces or so. And these represent the base models that we've taken out of Mudbox, and of course all the higher level representations, all the details were extracted in the form of vector displacement maps and reapplied onto a DX11 shader. You can see Viewport 2.0 is already in DX11 mode. So if I were to go in here and load the textures, they're already preloaded, so I'm going to hit 6 and they load immediately, and maybe turn on some lights. Let's turn off the wireframe and get a little closer to this model. You can see that with all those maps loaded, I still get really decent refresh rates on this character. So what that means is that I can still actually have a character rigged and possibly animated moving in my scene in Maya. So this is kind of where we would want to go with characters, very close to final representation. And in this case, this representation is essentially a representation of over 40 million polygons in the Maya viewport, fairly close to real time, where we're representing all the detail with vector displacement maps. So here it is. I'm going to kind of move around the scene. We can of course turn on anything that is Viewport 2.0, even though we're using the DX11 shaders, all that is respected. In other words, we can go into a screen space based AO and turn that on. You can see how that works. We could also turn on a depth of field, for example. And if I pick geometry, you can see that the actual vector displacement maps are working. The actual geometry is more or less submerged below the displaced tessellation of my DX11 shader. And so it's doing that for the entire character. So the next portion of this demonstration is going back to our data set. I'm going to talk a little bit about the rigging process before we go to MotionBuilder and build a live connection where we're going to set up something that mimics a virtual production setup. So we are going to, I'm going to switch to a different character, the other character that kind of features in this short, this animated short. So let's go ahead and switch to the girl. And you can see that the girl has a custom rig associated with it, and that's one of the new things, one of the things that was introduced in 2013, Maya 2013, is that you now have the ability to be able to retarget motion or to map motion through human IK onto not just the bones, which is you were able to do before, but directly onto these controllers which then drive the bones. And so this is a very useful thing to be able to do. In other words, you are able to continue to work the way you used to work if you're using these kinds of controllers. Or you're able to continue to use legacy rigs that have these kinds of setups. So let's start by teaching human IK what it is that I have in the scene. So we're going to focus in on the girl. I'm going to turn off the world here real quick, and then jump into an X-ray mode for just her, so that I can actually see the bones. So the first step here would be to define the skeleton. So we're teaching human IK about what it is that I have in this character. So the process here is very simple. You get a definition tab, and that's really the only thing we have at this point. And then you can start to select bones in here. And by selecting them, you can see that automatically these bones get mapped to the UI in the attribute editor for this in the HIK character control window. Now, when you do this, you can turn on mirror mapping. You can see the other side is automatically finished for you as well. If I grab a leg and pick a bone, you can see the other upper leg is also mapped. And if you, in this case, this is a skeleton that's fairly generic, and typically I would use anywhere between 3, 4, or 5 different kinds of skeletons that may have to be relaid out as far as proportions, but have the same number of joints and have the same configuration. So if you do that, you can actually write out .xml maps that allow you to control the mapping of this process. So in this case, if I go in and say, let's open up a template for this, and these are XML templates, I can go ahead and select one and map that so that it finishes off the character. So this has been done before. An XML file has been written out, and it's brought back in to automatically map all the bones in this character to the user interface that we have in here. Now we went from a red status, which basically tells you there are missing bones. In other words, there's missing information. Now that we went to a yellow status, it tells you that it actually isn't exactly in a T-pose, which is kind of the ideal position, but it doesn't really have to be. So anything but red will generally work as long as you know what you're doing. If I were to move this up, for example, you could see that all of a sudden all these bones go green. So once we've done this, we have to actually lock this, and we can move on to define the custom controllers. So let's go ahead and jump into a new tab, the Custom Rig tab. You can see that we have the Definition tab, we have the Custom Rig tab, and when we're done with the Custom Rig tab, we can actually start getting into the Controls tab, which is where all your Human IK controls will be listed. So we go to the Custom Rig, and we can pick, for example, the controller on the left hand, and we'll say assign that. We're going to go ahead and pick the other one, assign that. And this process too can be controlled by mapping an XML template. So let's go ahead and bring this in, and you can see that now it maps all of the controls on our character. Once this is done, we can go back to a non-X-rayed view, and I want to bring in a bit of motion. So we can jump into Visor, and you can see that we have our motion capture examples as well as our Human IK examples. And if I were to import something like a cartwheel clip, you can see what that looks like. You can see how that character is kind of cartwheeling over the top. I want to map that motion through Human IK onto our girl character. Now there's the layout of the skeletons on both these characters is different. The number of joints is different, and that's exactly what Human IK is so very good at. So let's go ahead and set the source here to look at that motion capture example, and then through the HIK controls, if we jump into the Controls tab, these are HIK controls. I can offset this character by so much so that we can see the motion side by side. This works the exact same way in MotionBuilder. In fact, MotionBuilder did this before it actually was available in Maya, but we have it in Maya now too. There is a distinct purpose for MotionBuilder though, and that is primarily for motion processing. It is a faster real-time engine. It allows you to process and see characters moving in real time faster, or you can see more characters at the same frame rate as you do in Maya. So if you have anywhere between 8 and 10 characters in MotionBuilder, you may only be able to see 2 characters in Maya. So if we can somehow put this in MotionBuilder and map the motion in MotionBuilder, build the control rig in MotionBuilder, and have MotionBuilder solve for all of this, but then at the same time stream that motion directly into Maya so that we can see it in the context of an environment, for example. Let's go ahead and turn the environment back on. Then we're really kind of using the two products for its intended purposes, and we're taking advantage of each of them in their own way. So in this case, you can see this character is kind of doing that cartwheel in the context of that environment, but this is not the motion that I want on this character. I actually want to use MotionBuilder to map a new clip on this girl. So let's go ahead and jump into HIK, and we're going to go back to the source clip here, and instead of having it point to the motion capture example, I'm going to go ahead and reset this back to the stance. So once the character is all set up, we need to select it and actually send it to MotionBuilder through a live connection UI. So here's our character, and I just need to make sure that some part of that character is picked. It doesn't really matter what it is, just make sure that something is picked. And let's go back to like a texture mode or so. We can now go to File, MotionBuilder, and you can see the one-click menus, which are largely the same for Softimage, Mudbox, MotionBuilder, and Max, with the exception of the live connection window. When I bring that up, it actually gives me a list of characters in the scene, and the character that we're currently working with is character 1. So if you look at character 1 here, there's a send button. There's an IP field where you can actually fill out an IP address. And so this doesn't have to stay local. You can actually send this to any machine anywhere on the planet, especially a machine that is rigged to work with a live capture stage and that has a session of MotionBuilder, that has a copy of MotionBuilder on it. So let's go ahead and make sure that we send this. When we send this, it's going to, if MotionBuilder is not running yet, it's going to launch MotionBuilder. I had it running in the background. You can see how it popped up real quick. I already had the scene loaded. So what I can do at this point is kind of move over and give this enough space so that MotionBuilder is visible. And let's go ahead and close this UI as well, so we can actually see this on the Maya side. So there's our UI. Let's minimize the live connection UI, and we have our character in MotionBuilder. So if I were to go in and say, let's grab that character now, any part of her, and start to rotate it, you could see how I'm driving Maya from within MotionBuilder. And that's really because this is a little more than just a one-click interoperability where we're sending files across. This is a live connection that is established between the two products that essentially in this case lets us run the MotionBuilder kernel inside of Maya. So it's MotionBuilder that's driving Maya at this point. Okay, so the first step here is to kind of pretend like we're on a virtual stage and bring in some content that makes sense in the context of a virtual stage. So we have a file. I have a file in here that includes a character as well as a camera that could mimic the kind of thing that we have on a virtual stage and would be linked to MotionBuilder. So let's go ahead and drag and drop that into the scene with all takes. And there's one take in here called the live mocap session that we can start to take a look at, and this will continue to be our working camera, for example. So if I go in here, you can see the motion that comes in. I haven't really connected anything else to that character yet. Our character from Maya is still completely independent, but we're going to do that here in just a second. So the character as well as the camera are being constrained in a way that very much mimics the same way it's done on a virtual stage, where a live actor would constrain the virtual character inside of MotionBuilder. So I'm kind of jury-rigging this in a way that we can illustrate a virtual production setup and why we would set this up this way. So if we can take characters from Maya, stick them into MotionBuilder, and to have MotionBuilder do the heavy lifting in terms of animation processing and HIK solving, then we can have more characters in Maya essentially. Because the only thing that it sends from MotionBuilder to Maya is XYZ joint rotation. So we don't have to maintain any human IK rigs or extra character clips, like source clips for animation. Now this also goes for a virtual production setup where we have live actors run our virtual characters and then have them stream into Maya. Now think about this in a way where we would have a character like this in Maya against a backdrop of either an Alembic file, which will be quite a bit faster for static geometry, or a GPU cache file, which will be again an order of magnitude faster than that. So we can have final resolution geometry in the backdrop with characters that we used to be able to, let's say 3-4 characters of moderate complexity, be able to run anywhere between half to full real time, whereas in MotionBuilder we could do 12 to 15 characters that way, so quite a bit faster. So if we do this in MotionBuilder, we just get more mileage out of our software lineup. Alright, so having done this, I want to go in and actually connect this character to this character. So we're going to go ahead and set that first up here, and then I'm going to go ahead and down here define the source. Now when I do that, you can see how in Maya she also pops over to the position of that character. So if I were to go in here and kind of scrub through my timeline, you could see that MotionBuilder again takes a hold of Maya and kind of animates, moves my character through the scene. Now the problem here is that if I were to create, let's say, a 2-pane layout, and I'm going to open up MotionBuilder, you can see how this continues to be live in Maya, and I'm going to get back to that a little bit later on. But before I do that, I kind of want a side-by-side view inside of MotionBuilder. So by making the viewer layout a side-by-side and then selecting this camera And the camera that came in, which is the camera that's being constrained by those red constraints that you saw. You can see it show up in here in the working view. You can see that there's a little bit of an offset between, especially in the beginning, between our character coming in from Maya and our character that is the source. So what I could do is say, okay, let's go ahead and try and fix that by saying, by selecting our character and then matching the source. And you can see how she pops over there. So imagine that your virtual actor is taking some big strides, moving around. You want or you're not your virtual actor, your live actor. You want your virtual character to kind of follow that. You can turn on match. Now in MotionBuilder, the controls to kind of do that at a percentage as well, a partial kind of match. But right now we want a full match so that whatever we capture in terms of the camera motion and what the camera sees makes sense in the context of our characters. So some of the virtual production tools that we added in 2013 for MotionBuilder are also related to information, especially information related to directorial control, things like heads-up displays. So let's go into the Elements tab, or the Elements folder here. I'm going to drag a HUD into my heads-up display folder. So there it is. Let's go ahead and do that. Open it up. There's the HUD folder. I'm going to rename this to maybe something like My HUD, and double click on this so we get the editor for the heads-up display. Let's open that up a bit so we can see the controls and create a new element in here. And let's say we'll give this a name. We can call this border, for example, and then select a rectangle, a shape that will be added to this HUD. And when I hit create, you can see it gives you all the controls, but it's not actually adding it to the camera, and that's really because we haven't connected it to the camera. So on the bottom left here, I would have to open up my camera list and find the camera I want to work with, which is the HD camera here at the bottom of the list, and drag and drop that onto that camera. Say add to camera. And now as soon as you do that, you can see that square shows up. And if I go in here and modify the color and change the opacity, and then maybe also place this in the center of our view right there, we can then turn off things like scale uniformly and maybe scale it up or scale it sideways like that to create a border kind of effect. We can do the same thing at the very top. Maybe I want to go ahead and list the take name. The take name right now is Live Mocap Session. So let's go ahead and hit create, and you can see how that adds it. Now if I then were to go in and say let's go ahead and control the size of that, that's the size of that rectangle. Down here you can see that you get the same set of controls for your text. Maybe it needs to be yellow, and then we can go ahead and place this in the scene, either that direction or maybe over here somewhere. Other things that I could do is if I go in here and create another HUD element and maybe set this to, let's say we'll set this to record light, and I can go in and maybe move this to the very top by simply selecting one of these and putting it right there in the corner. Now this is going to tell me when I'm ready to record, or it's going to tell me when I'm actually recording. So it kind of gives you a recording status for this particular camera. Let's go ahead and load an existing UI that I already have in the scene. I already created one over here, and I want to connect that to this camera. So drag and drop that onto the HD camera. Connected, and you'll see that in this case we get a path to the file that's actually loaded. The name of the camera on the top right. We have a frame per second refresh rate, and I could actually change that in here. Maybe I want to change that to 24 or something other than, or go back to 23976. A field of view, a time code, a frame value, name of the session, and free memory. And you could see that free memory is kind of fluttering or floating depending on how much memory is still available for me to use. Now this could be useful when it comes to recording a session. By default, a recorded session actually gets recorded to memory. One of the really nice things about MotionBuilder in 2013 is the fact that we can actually record to disk, allowing for much longer, much more complex recording sessions. There's really no limit. The only limit is the amount of recording space, the amount of disk space you have. Okay, so all this information displayed and captured within a single UI. I also have a recording button in here, and so I kind of want to get to the next step, which is recording this particular session. So once we are set up and once we are live and our characters are connected to the proper virtual characters, we can then actually record and capture all of this information. So the way to do that would be to go into the story tool. I'm going to increase the size of my story editor just a little bit, and you can see that we have a track like this for the camera and we have a track for the character. So if I go to the properties tab for our camera, you'll see that, let's go ahead and load that, there's a recording tab or a recording section at the very bottom. What I want to do is I want to specify where I'm going to record to, and in this case I'm going to select the temp directory, and then down in here we have a token system that allows you to modify the start time code value, the start frame value, the name of course, start date, start time, take name, and there are many other things that can be done with that token system to make it work within your asset management system. Let's do the same thing for our character. So we're going to go to record, we're going to specify the temp directory down in here, and then we can go ahead and turn on the recording switches for these individual tracks. So let's go ahead and bring this up, and in here you can define what it is that you'll be recording. So in this case, translate, rotate for the camera. That's exactly what I want to record. Maybe I want to record things like field of view or roll. These things can be recorded as well. So let's go ahead and include that too. And then say OK. You can see that this button now goes green. I'm going to do the same thing for this character. It's already set up for this character. All the translate, rotate, scale values for this character will be recorded. So let's go ahead and turn that on. And now we can actually switch into a recording mode by determining, do I want to record to RAM, the zeros and ones up here, or do I want to record to disk? And by displaying the little diskette on this icon, it's a toggle. You'll be recording to disk. So what that does is it actually spits out temp files into that temp directory that I selected, and then as soon as I stop my recording, it builds the FBX files that I can then bring back into the software. So once this is done, I'm going to make sure that everything is rewound to the beginning. I'm going to hit record. You can see that it goes green. I'm now ready to record. I'm still not recording, and as soon as I hit play, this will start to record. You can see my recording switch just turned to red, and I'm going to let this run for a little bit, and you can see that as I do this, it produces clips inside of my story tool. So let's go ahead and stop that. As soon as you stop that, it offloads these files. It's really not offloading them. It's simply building the FBX files inside of my temp directory that I can then go in and right click and say load clips into the story tool, so that I can now go ahead and edit this information. So if I, for example, look at the camera that we brought in, this camera has been captured as well. It has constraints on it, and so if I were to disconnect the constraints, for example, by going to the camera itself, the HD camera itself, we can go into rigid body and turn off the active and lock status so that we're disconnecting it. There we go. And if I then go back to my story tool in here, as I scrub through this, my clip is working. I can also move the clip, and as I move the clip, obviously you can see how it's adjusting the camera and it's leaving the constraints behind. And that's exactly what I want to do. I can also go in here and kind of cut this up any way I want by selecting this clip and then slicing that maybe there and maybe there, and then maybe we'll cut this twice more, once and twice, and I can go in and maybe select sections of a clip. For example, that one right there, we'll delete that, we'll delete that, and now we have some gaps in our animation. I can also do things like, if this is our camera animation up here, and this is our camera animation over here, I can go ahead and stretch this out, and maybe do a frame blend between these two clips so we get a nice transition. And that's how you can start to edit the information and the clips on your characters after it's recorded. Okay, so a last step would have to include things like getting this stuff to Maya, which would simply be selecting the individual pieces like the camera. In the case of the camera we imported into MotionBuilder and we didn't really bring it into Maya. It doesn't exist in Maya. So we actually have to add this to the Maya scene by sending this through one click. The character animation, however, is something that we can simply update, and when we update it, the character animation will make it into Maya. Now, again, the beauty here is the fact that we can have MotionBuilder do all the heavy lifting as far as the character processing, the obviously the connection to a live stage with live actors that drive your virtual characters, but then have all that stuff kind of stream into Maya as we do this. So if I go back to Maya, we should still have that established connection inside of Maya. You can see our character still operating. We can also import another camera if I were to do that. Maybe we have another camera in here that I want to bring in, this one right here. Let's go ahead and merge this with the scene. This will be a separate take, so it'll actually add a take to my list here. So you can see that down in here you have the live mocap session, which is that, which will still run Maya. And then over here we have our new camera with new camera animation. And so if I were to go in here and either switch this to this new camera view, which we can do, let's go ahead and do that real quick, or do a side-by-side. Actually, 3 panes are going to start to get pretty crowded. You get the idea. Down in here I would want to change this to the crane camera, right? So something like that. I'm just doing this to show you that you can do this, but I actually have to scale down the UI for Camtasia purposes, right? And we're just focusing in on this particular take. So we've switched takes and turned off the live mocap session, which you can get back to if you select that. So that's kind of how you can start to populate your scene with cameras. Now the other thing that's kind of nice is if I were to go back to like a 2-pane layout, and in this case what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this my we're going to make this our producer perspective, and we're going to make this one our HD cam. And the reason why I'm switching these is because the first panel that's listed here is the one that's being used for the video out window. So if you have a separate LCD panel, for example, and we want to be able to say, okay, let's create a video out panel, you can see that this is a tear-off window that I can stick on any other LCD panel for directorial control. And through that UI, it provides all the feedback required to be able to make creative decisions. Move this, move that, switch camera, show me this, maybe move the character or move certain elements out of the way. And so that's the kind of thing that we can start to use to improve the kind of creative control a director might want over a scene like this. Okay, so that's those are some of the virtual production tools. So kind of in conclusion here, the reason why I'm showing you the Mudbox stuff as well is because that kind of leads up to the DX11 shaders inside of Maya. Having DX11 shaders that are so much faster, that work with compiled shader files that you can load for different elements on your character and still get very reasonable performance on a rigged character, for example. Now, if we can then also kind of take advantage of the MotionBuilder Maya path and live connection functionality, having a GPU cache against the background, which is much faster, and having characters that don't have to solve inside of Maya, but rather do that in MotionBuilder, we can start to bring things together inside of Maya in a more final form. And that's kind of the point of all of this. Of course, virtual production is a big part of that in this case, or for this particular webinar. That's it. Thank you very much, and I hope that was helpful.